Hi, I'm Steve Hassan, and I'm delighted to be with a new friend and former colleague because she just told me she retired from being a therapist, Amy Avalon. Thank you so much for joining with me today to discuss this important topic of therapist abuse.
Thank you, Steve. It is an important topic when people don't really talk about ever. So,
Yeah. So, my work started from the cults of the Moonies and Jim Jones and all these high profile cults. But over the decades, I've learned about all kinds of undue influence situations where someone in authority takes advantage of someone else for their own power, money, or sex, or all three. And I have had clients who've had loved ones who've gotten under the spell of a therapist, a licensed therapist, psychiatrist, psychologist, social worker, licensed mental health counselor, to the point where they were isolating from family and spending huge amounts of money and even having sex with in some cases. So tell us your story and what you want the public to best understand about this problem. Because when we first chatted, you said it's so widespread. It's amazing.
it is very widespread. I use the word rampant, which I know
Hmm.
offends a lot of colleagues, but it is. And Me Too has brought a lot of things to light in so many fields. And what is amazing to me is still, for some reason, our field of therapy remains somewhat untouched.
Hmm.
And we're seeing that it really, this across every place where someone has power over anyone, it's pretty much you can count on at least 10% of the practitioners are doing something that they shouldn't be doing, likely more. But in our field, there's still this idea that, oh, therapists just don't do that. But in fact, they do. And I think if anyone were willing to really investigate it, they'd find it just as rampant as we found in the clergy. Um,
Yeah, I'm afraid so. And the setup of states as well as institutions where I'm licensed by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, but I'm also a member of the American Counseling Association that has its ethical guidelines, and the NCC, the Nationally Certified Counselor, NBCC, has its own ethical guidelines, but um, unless someone reports an abuse and unless there's rigorous independent investigation that's really dedicated to protecting the public, a lot of these problems get washed aside,
yes, they do.
unfortunately.
They do. And in fact, a lot of victims don't even know to call it abuse. So they don't, and a lot of victims don't even know what the ethics codes are
Right.
for whomever they're seeing. Some of them don't even realize that we have this whole list of codes that we have to follow and that we have to renew, that we have to
Yes.
continue,
Yeah,
in order
every
to
2 years I need
work.
to get continuing ed credits and ethics upgrades. I had an ethics test I had to for part of my training
Mhm.
about online work. We both have been therapists for a long time, and in our blood, we got into this work to help people, and so to be aware that people are being harmed because they trusted a therapist because they had a credential. And then we're going to get later into people who don't have credentials or say they have credentials and then you find out they don't, as well as people have zero training at all but claim to have all kinds of great insights that are going to help people. But let's come back to, are you willing to share a little bit how you got this problem came to your attention most powerfully?
I wonder if it was the same for you in school, Steve, when you were training, is that in our ethics class, we learn you just never sleep with a patient. It's just the cardinal sin, if you
You
will.
don't kiss on the lips. What do you mean? Or hug
Can't even
even,
touch, right?
right? They didn't even
Not
want
even-
hugging at all,
Right.
much less having intercourse or, having affairs with married people that are your clients. It's just, of course we were taught that.
Of course, in very basic training. And I remember sitting in my class and thinking, well, that's never going to happen to me. That's never going to come and darken my doorstep in
Mm-hmm.
the little boutique practice that I was going to have. And I had a very wonderful career for many years.
Mm-hmm.
And as it turned out, I discovered that a very close friend and colleague of mine, someone that I really respected and loved and felt like family to me, I found out that he was sleeping with a patient. And this patient was 35 years younger than him, married, um, you know, very vulnerable. And I had to intervene.
Uh-huh.
And what happened as a result of that intervention really opened my eyes to this problem, how widespread it is, how hard it is. Even in the field, there were a lot of my colleagues who were telling me, just walk away from this and just put your head down and go, move your offices and just keep going and get away from this.
As opposed to report him in a
As
formal
opposed to,
complaint, which you
yeah,
did. Good
they
for
were
you.
worried what would happen to me.
Mm-hmm.
And looking back, they were absolutely right. I was absolutely intimidated. I was threatened. I was accused of all sorts of things. I think we saw a lot with Dr. Ford and Brett Kavanaugh. The character assault is very real. And I'm just very lucky that I had the resources and support that I did.
So I just want to say for people who may have missed that, you were referring to now Supreme Court Justice Kavanaugh and the woman who's alleged that he had assaulted her sexually in high school, correct? And then the accuser, who is a very well respected social psychologist, I believe,
Yeah.
publicly told the story, and she got attacked.
Death threats,
Yeah.
many, many. And then she's had to move her home several times too.
Yeah, so whistleblowing can be dangerous when you're going up against authority figures. But coming back to the bigger frame, if I may, is just that we need to categorically say that there's a power imbalance with a priest, with a therapist, with someone older than you who may remind you of daddy or mommy or something like that. And if you're vulnerable, that's why you're going for therapy. There's some stressor, anxiety, depression, sleep problems, whatever. You're going to this person and trusting them with your most intimate details of your life. And someone who is unethical can use that information and manipulate them, turn it around on them, that they seduce them,
Yeah.
even though they're in the power position and the responsibility is solely with them to say
So,
no and to have good boundaries. Well, tell a little bit more of your story, because you shared before we turned on the recording that this victim of his actually was used as a weapon of sorts.
absolutely. I think, and that happens a lot. While the victim is still in the thrall, they're still under the spell, thinking that this is the love of their life and their soulmate, and that this is somehow transcending the ethics.
Right.
Um, you know, Unfortunately, her abuser triangulated us, said that my intervention was actually what was causing the harm, to insist that he terminate the relationship, refer her to another psychologist, and to get help. He needed to get supervision, which is how we're told in our ethics codes to intervene at first, which I think is up for discussion too, because it shouldn't have been my job to give him that kind of a chance.
Right.
I should not have, I'm not trained to figure out if someone's fit to practice or not. And in our codes, it says, that you try to intervene as you can reasonably.
Right.
I have since come to believe that there is no reasonable way to reason with someone who is willing to have sex with a patient.
Mm-hmm.
They're not wired the way that we think that they are. And so,
Many of them are narcissists and psychopaths, just to name it.
absolutely. Yes. Thank you for naming it, because that's
I couldn't help myself. It's the stereotypical profile of cult leaders, so why wouldn't
it is. And
uh,
as I said to you, we call it a cult of one.
yeah,
Um,
exactly.
but it's very similar tactics. And as I've seen some of the work that you've done. Here you have this therapist who is finding out all of the hot buttons. And
Yep.
this is the client is being a good client by revealing what it is they're
Yeah.
looking for, their dreams, their secret yearnings. And the therapist mirrors that back and makes this client believe that, oh, if it weren't for this, we happen to meet as therapist and client, but really, if we had met anywhere else, we would be soulmates, divinely ordained.
Yeah, they typically say that they're soulmates or they were married in another lifetime is another one.
Absolutely. Yes.
And all kinds of storytelling to
Yes.
make it okay. And I would add, many of them are using hypnotic language and hypnotic techniques, whether it's NLP, Ericksonian conversational style, and get a second opinion. You know, if you have any feeling in you, is this right or is this wrong or is this going well? Get a second opinion. And there are people who are experts in dealing with abusive people and therapists, and you can tell the story of what were triggering your alarm bells if you're listening to this and wondering, I wonder if this fits, which I actually assume you're watching this because you already have that knowledge or an inkling, or you have a family member or friend that maybe you've been estranged from years. It's another technique I just wanted to mention, if I may, Amy, that the controller wants to isolate the person from the most influential people in their life. So they often work on the person against their mother, their father, their siblings, their spouse, to undermine them, to keep the secret so their abuse can continue. That's
Well,
another big warning flag. If you're being estranged from anyone in your family, get a second opinion. But go
right.
on, please.
Well, I think in therapy, it can happen so slowly. It's like water on a rock. The grooming process can happen sometimes over years, certainly over months. And I believe that it happens from the very first phone call. I believe that these kinds of psychopaths groom everyone around them, and it's just how they relate to people in the world. But so many people, yeah, if they look back, there was a little bit of a hesitation, but they overrode that intuition, and because they blamed themselves as just being too reactive, too judgmental, whatever it may be. But the grooming process is very slow. So most of the victims that we talk to at TAL, at therapyabuse.org, is that they really didn't see it coming. And it seemed organically to unfold. So
Right.
they really thought that it was an affair more
Mhm.
so than abuse.
Right.
And they didn't realize that all of these things, like the gateway in my opinion, is the therapist's self-disclosure. That's
Hmm.
the gateway to this whole grooming process. So they don't even know that we aren't supposed to do that per our
Hmm.
ethics codes. So they think it's all just very chummy and it's just giggles and a real connection and a deep bond, and that this is the natural outflowing. This sexual relationship or emotional relationship is just the natural progression of a really deep connection, and it's
Right.
never.
And there was a very good book. It's now out of print, but I still can find it on Amazon. The Consumer's Guide to Psychotherapy. It was by Engler and Goleman, Dan Goleman, who did emotional intelligence and all of that. And I just really think a book like that needs to be really widely available because it explains the goal of therapy is to get out of therapy. It's to
Yeah.
like be functional, to
Yeah.
develop real friends that you can disclose all your private stuff to. You shouldn't need to pay a professional to do that. And it talks about different therapists, they have different training with different skill sets for different problems. And if you're not trained to work on the presenting problem that the person has, your ethical obligation is to refer to someone who does or get supervision and learn how to do it. But you should be paying as a therapist the supervisor, not the client paying the supervisor to train you. And just the consumer guide of like, how do you pick an ethical therapist? What should you expect in the beginning and the middle? How do you do closure at the end? And it's just people need to understand we're paying the therapist.
Yes.
You're in charge, not the other way around. And that if you ask direct questions, you should get direct answers. And if you get, well, that's your childhood issues, or that you're just projecting, or other kinds of deflections other than answering my question. Are you, fantasizing about me when I'm not in session? Yes or no? And of course, the psychopath can lie convincingly, but
Very convincingly.
it's still you're signaling to the unethical therapist you're on to them, and
And
it's
that's
please.
true. But I do think that victims really don't see it coming the same way that people who fall into cults don't think that they're falling into something that's going to destroy their lives. They think it's actually going to help them.
Yep.
And one of the things that we do all the time as therapists is try to help people normalize their feelings. So, you hate your mother or your father. A lot of people do, right? And or sort of letting them know you don't have to be ashamed of having these feelings. They're okay. You don't have to act on them, but
Right.
they are okay. And I think what happens with the psychopath is that the grooming will happen that not only are your feelings normal, but any behaviors that might happen out of those feelings must be normal too. So
Hmm.
if you're feeling attracted to me, maybe we should explore that.
Hmm.
And maybe it's not so, they try to normalize even the abuse,
Hmm.
that this is just actually for their own good. I mean, my colleague said he was helping this
Oh
patient.
God. So
They
I've
all
heard
say
the
that.
same thing. I've also worked with victims of gurus and cult
Yes,
leaders who heard that they had been abused as a child sexually and were going to fix it by having sex with them and giving them spiritual sex
yes.
and
And my colleague said
re-victimizing
the
them.
same thing. He said, she's been abused. I wanted her to be with a real man who really could show her what real sex was like.
Yeah. So I want to come back to power, money, sex are the three primary. People say, why do cult leaders do what they do? And it's the same thing with a cult leader who is a therapist shingle out. And again, I want to name it. It can be a psychiatrist, a psychologist, a social worker, a licensed counselor of any kind. But I also want to name that there are many people who've lost their licenses because of ethical things, but still advertise themselves as if they were still licensed and practicing. And you got to check to see if a license is up and whether there are complaints against it. But then there's a whole slew of people who've left the profession, but they still hang a shingle up. Now they're calling themselves life coaches or
Mhm.
coaches of many different stripes, but they have zero mental health training, zero ethical guidelines. And so there's this huge abuse that's taking place under the guise of self development, self actualization, recovering from past trauma. So, so tell
My
me,
colleague continued to practice after he lost his license.
he did.
Yes, and the board in Massachusetts, where you are, deemed him a threat to the public health. He lost his license very swiftly.
Yep.
But even the people who were in his suite just let him continue practicing for another year.
Yeah. And then a lot of perpetrators just move to another state,
Yes, we've
get
started.
licensed elsewhere.
Yeah.
So, but we want to trust authority figures, who are well credentialed, and but we don't want to ever give up our personal power or our critical faculties, and we don't want to ever be silenced from reality testing strategies. So I say publicly that if you ever have been in therapy, for example, for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years with the same person, really step back and go, what did I enter therapy for? What actually have I gotten from it? How much money have I spent? And isn't it time to reality test, get a second opinion, a third opinion, and if I still have issues, find someone who will actually be problem focused, or I should say solution focused, to help you resolve the issue. Um, and be very wary of anybody that again causes you to be estranged from people in your life who are saying that's not ethical. She shouldn't be seeing mom, dad, brother, sister in individual therapy 3 times a week for 20 years. Like, whenever I say that, would anyone do that? Yes, unfortunately. But as part of our training, it's like you're either their therapist or you're a couples therapist, in which you're a therapist to the couple, or you're a family therapist if you have training for that, as I do. Then you're a therapist to the family, but you can't do everything. You can't do all the roles because there's conflict of interest. You can never have that ability, unfortunately, as a single human being. So you have to do conjoint therapy with other therapists. One's a family therapist, one's a couples therapist. Get individual therapists, and then you can get permission to talk to them to discuss things. But again, the public just doesn't know any better.
It doesn't. And I do think that there has been this normalization of being in therapy, and that you need therapy anytime you feel uncomfortable. Oh, I need therapy. Or you find out something about your past, or you have a memory that comes up. I need therapy. There's been a brainwashing in our society that we all need therapy, and that something that may have caused you trauma is going to stay with you for years. That's not true. And
Correct. It's
as you
not.
said, therapy needs to have an end, and should have a progression throughout towards goals. And if
Yep.
always checking in every month or two with my clients. Okay, here's what we came in to work on. Do you feel like we're making progress? Are we done with this thing? Let's move on here. The goal from the very first session is the final session.
Right.
And I think that has been kind of evaporated for a lot of people, and they see it more as going to the gym. Well, you have to keep your physical body in shape for weekly forever, so maybe you do with your mental body, but it's not true.
Yeah, you want to have some close friends to just process life
Yes.
stuff. And if you have a therapist, you want to work on something concrete, specific, time limited, where you can judge this has worked or it hasn't worked. And, so I just want to add in, if I may, it's a little bit tangential in a certain way, but so many people have been born into authoritarian cults or have had experiences with religious cults or political cults, therapy cults, large group awareness training cults, multi-level marketing cults, and they see a therapist because of that, but the therapist knows nothing about cults. And that's an ethical violation as well.
Right, that's going beyond your scope of competence, right?
Yeah, and I hear all the time from people are like, I was seeing this person for 5 years and I was teaching them about my experience in the cult, and they didn't know anything. And they never read a book, they never sought supervision. Warning, warning. There's something wrong with this. And now we're talking, it's February of 2021, and there are literally millions of people who've been co-opted by psyops like QAnon, where they're believing in green reptiles or flat earths or alien beings or whatever. And mental health professionals are not trained on how to work with them, and they go back to childhood of origin issues instead of saying, when did you first adopt this new, totalistic belief?
And the danger of that is, of course, you're blaming the victim. Oh, this must be rooted in your childhood. This can happen to anyone. And in fact, what I've learned since everything happened to me, and that I've been a responder with TEL, which is the therapy exploitation link line,
Right.
is that people, especially people in our field, think that victims of therapy abuse or even cults are somehow compromised people, but they're actually not. I would say 90% of the victims are intelligent, well educated,
Exactly.
very compassionate, accomplished people. And as a result of their education and their willingness to be open minded, they are generally willing to self reflect and to see, maybe I'm not seeing this whole picture. So they're more open minded in a way. And that is exploited by the cult leader. So you have these therapists saying, well, there must be something in your past that made you susceptible to this, as opposed to, this is a leader who is using mind control
Exactly.
techniques that anybody could fall prey to if they didn't know.
Yep.
So one of the analogies that I use with victims is, instead of blaming yourself, imagine it's poison ivy. You don't know poison ivy. You've never seen it. If you come out of the woods with a rash, do you say it's because of your past? No, it's because
I like the analogy.
you just didn't know the plant. Now that you know it, you know to avoid it.
Right.
It wasn't your fault that you had the normal reaction to it that the plant is designed to do.
Right. So, great point. And I'll just add from my research with social psychology, one of the most important principles is called the fundamental attribution error. I don't know if you've heard of it.
Oh, tell me this.
But in social psychology, and this is a phenomenon all around the world, when you ask a person why another person did what they did, they have an unconscious bias to give attribution to the person, to their disposition, to their personality, to their history, instead of looking at the social context and the influences on them. So why did Steve get into the Moonies? Oh, he must not have been smart. He must have come from a bad family. He didn't have a good religious education. Instead of, Steve's girlfriend dumped him. He was kind of blue. These women flirted with him, lying to him, saying they were students, saying they weren't part of any type of organized religious group. And they lied to him and put him through a systematic social influence process, right?
Yes, that's grooming, is basically what you just described.
Exactly. And I guess I want to also just state categorically, we're all human beings, and I've yet to meet anyone who had a perfect childhood, didn't have any traumas or didn't have, some issues. And so, but that doesn't mean that's why they were abused by a cult guru or a therapist.
Absolutely
You
not.
know?
Yeah, there's so much victim blaming, and that's why. Have you heard of the acronym DARVO?
I have, but remind me what it
Yeah,
is.
so because that's also what you're. Now that you've put this context, it's deny, attack, and reverse victim and offender. And so what you will have is, when you have a whistleblower or a victim who comes forward, you will have the response from the abuser, which says, "I didn't do it. In fact, you did it to me, and I'm the one who is victimized here."
Yep.
And they found, because of exactly what you were just talking about, that it actually works quite well.
Yeah.
People do tend to say, "Oh, I think that person was vulnerable." And my colleague jumped on that right away. He was vulnerable. She was seductive. I wasn't. He even said that, if I had been kinder to him as a colleague, this never would have happened.
Right.
That I was very critical of him, and so he was vulnerable. And I'm thinking, oh, please, So, but it really worked.
It really does, and it is part of the cult leader playbook.
Well, we see it on their national stage, right?
Exactly. It's in my book, A Cult of Trump, and I compare Trump with Jim Jones and Hubbard and Moon and Keith Raniere, who's in jail for 120 years for trafficking as well. It's incredibly valuable work. I'm very grateful for your willingness to help people who are reaching out, saying, what happened to me, and wanting to make some sense of it. And Tell has a website, which we'll link to in the blog. Is there anything else, if you take a minute to think, what else do you want to say to the public? Like, what would you say to a person who's been in therapy for 10 years or longer with the same therapist and has bad feelings towards their family and has been giving huge amounts of money to the therapist for all those years? What's your advice?
Well, what I would ask them first is to say, what do you think would happen if you just stopped seeing that person? And notice the reaction in them. Because if they have an intense fear of leaving this person, that's a problem. And
Yep.
that's a real hallmark that what is happening is not therapy at all. Because if you're afraid to leave and you've become dependent and addicted to this therapy, you're in trouble. And it's important to get help. And again, I just also, for colleagues, for people who are friends, loved ones, this is going on a lot, and it isn't the fault of the victim. The therapist has 100% control of those boundaries all the
Yep.
time.
100%, I agree. It's the
100%.
burden is on the therapist to do no harm and not on the client or the patient.
Exactly.
Um,
Exactly.
and if you have been estranged from your family because you've been told for years how evil your mother is, your father is, your siblings, etc., what advice do you have for someone who's coming to that realization? How do they build connections again with all the people that they said all these horrible things to? And
Right. Well, certainly to have compassion for themselves and to realize, I think the awareness is key to recognize what actually happened, and then to really embrace that this was done to them, so that they can lay the blame where it belongs, so that when they are building those connections, they're in a place of, instead of blaming themselves and feeling like they have to grovel back to these people, just saying, I want to tell you that I was really brainwashed. I was under the influence, and I am sorry for what happened with that, but not to go into this place of deep self blame, to really help other people recognize that, you were injured.
right. So I want to just share that I assume you've done this too for some people that have reached out for you to help, but I've done this also, is just to offer, if they're that afraid to make the initial step to a key family member, a sibling or whoever they feel like they had the best relationship with prior. I can, with a release, offer to be a bridge person to say, listen, I've been talking with your sister. I've come to listen to what's happened. She was a victim of an abusive therapist who had mind controlled her, and she really is wanting to reconnect with you and the family, and just kind of lay the groundwork for that, and that can smooth some of those fears. Because it was such a great question, like what if I stop, what do I think is going to happen? And
Mhm.
if phobias pop into your mind that everyone's going to hate you forever, like your family will never accept you back, it's like, no, that's not necessarily true. They
Right.
may need some help understanding and to process their own trauma, because it was very traumatizing to be estranged and to hear all kinds of terrible things leveled at you.
Yes, I think what is so helpful in the work that you do for people who come to you, and certainly what we do at Tell, is when victims reach out to us, the first thing we try to do is help them understand the course of the symptoms, so that
Mm,
it becomes, they can expect you're going to go through these feelings. It's normal to want to protect your abuser. It's normal to have withdrawal feelings and wanting
mm,
to get back, so that they can start to see that what they're experiencing is kind of the normal course of the symptoms that
mm.
arise from this, so that, they're not still feeling like they're just this strange person who got co-opted, that this is how anybody would respond,
Yeah,
and
no,
they
I think
expect.
sharing other stories of other clients and hearing about other cases, learning about cults definitely creates a good context. I'm always personally in my profession very leery about being prescriptive to predict what course the person's going to go through, because they may not. Um, and But again, I want to come back to what I said earlier. For me and my training, it's like the purpose of therapy is to get out of therapy and live your life. and be a fully functioning person with the locus of control in you, where you're using critical thinking as well as intuition, where you have a good mind-body alignment, good relationships that are nurturing to you and positive, where you're doing meaningful work and purpose in your life. That's kind of the recipe for good living.
Yes. Yes. Just like anything, when you break a bone, you don't expect to be nurturing and doing physical therapy on that forever.
Right,
There's
exactly.
a time for healing, and then
Absolutely.
fun.
And there is life after cult, or there is life after mind control relationship.
Yeah.
But you need to learn what's healthy and what's normal.
What's healthy and normal. And I've heard you say this before in your presentation, and I think it's so important that people hear. And that's what I was speaking to in terms of what people could expect. I like to give them hope that actually a lot of victims are quite resilient. Once they're given the right information, the right tools, it's amazing how things can begin to turn around. But when you don't have that knowledge, people can stay stuck for years.
Exactly.
But once they have the knowledge, it's like the key opens the safe and then they're off and running. And so it can really turn around very quickly. We have certainly people who reach out to tell. It's very often they say, I think my story is different. I think that my therapist is actually a really nice guy and I don't want to turn him in and I don't want to report. And then pretty quickly, once they put all the pieces together, there they are filing the report and very,
Hmm.
very happy to do so that no one else goes through what they went through.
Yep. And I would also add, a lot of people don't choose to do the formal complaint, and I don't try to pressure them or guilt trip them into doing that. But they often, will come around to it to the point where they see some other story where someone didn't tell and the abuse continued. And I think when the Larry Nasser case broke and there were just hundreds of young girls and women who had been abused by them, and they all were like, I should have talked about it,
Mm-hmm.
and the whole structure, the whole system was reinforcing this idea of secrecy and let's protect the sport and let's protect him and blah, blah, blah. Instead of we're human beings and we were being violated.
Yes, yes. And that when all of those stories came out, that was with Harvey Weinstein kind of ushered in that whole fall was right after I had discovered what was going on with my.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And Sarah Edmondson went public about Nexium and being branded. That was in that period as well. The two men who had been abused by Michael Jackson came forward in that period. And that's another point I want to make, that men can be abused by women therapists as easily as the other way around.
Absolutely.
So I want to thank you for taking the time and sharing, and we'll do a blog and we'll add links. And Estelle Dish kindly gave me permission to put on my website a really great checklist that anyone who's in therapy can look through and see how many checks they can do and get a second opinion.
That's a great list that she made up. It's very eye-opening.
Yeah, I just think it needs broader exposure to everybody.
Yes.
So, thank you so much, Amy.
Thank you, Steve.
Yeah, great, and continued good luck in your move and your new location, and we'll be in touch. We'll let you know when this drops.